everyone. Happy Monday. Happy live stream. Happy to have you all here with me. Going to give people a couple minutes to join. Moments, not really minutes. And then I'll start by just talking about what I've been doing for the past week or so since we last talked, and talking about some kind of newsworthy topics that I want to make sure that I have an opportunity to share and then talk about. And then as questions come in, we will be sure to hit people's questions. So what I want to start with first is what we've been up to this past week. Hopefully you had an opportunity to see that we did a 24-hour live stream fundraiser. So this is now the third day in a row that I've been live streaming, which is definitely a change for me and for the campaign. It was so much fun. I really hope that you had an opportunity to catch some of it. We were on our Twitch channel from 11 a.m. on Saturday until 11 a.m. on Sunday with a different act and performer every hour or so. There were musicians and comedians and people baking and people doing quite a bit of research into Delaware facts and then sharing them with us and then taking calls from the audience. So it was incredibly fantastic and I really enjoyed it. I am so grateful to everyone who performed. I'm also really grateful to all of the other Working Families Party candidates who joined a roundtable. So we're talking about Sinead Darby got on, who you've seen me stream with before, Kobe Owens, both of whom are running for Wilmington City Council, Marie Pinkney, who we've had on the stream, and Medina Wilson Anton, who we've also had on the stream, running for our state legislature and Senate. And we had an opportunity to talk with them about all of the things that are important to our state and to our country and look at the problems that we're facing and the vision that we have from all levels of government. So that was awesome. And I just want to take a moment to again shout out all of the volunteers and the team members that made this event as incredible as it was. Like, they worked so hard to put this together, to get really incredible guests, to find talent who was willing to join us and kind of take a shot in the dark at something that really had not been done before. This was something that I have not seen any campaign do, or really any organization do, is using a platform like Twitch, which is often used, just if you're not sure, for video game streaming or for kind of podcast streaming and conversations between people. And using that platform where there's a different type of audience from Facebook and Twitter and all the other tools that we use to say, we're going to put on basically 24 hours of entertainment, and in response, we'd love for you to donate and sign up to volunteer and become a part of our campaign. And it worked. And they did that again without having any map to follow of how to get there. And what ended up happening is that we were actually able to raise, just from that Twitch stream alone, $10,300. So in 24 hours, we raised over $10,000 from that stream. So there were hundreds of people that tuned in, people at all hours of the night. I imagine that my campaign team is a little maybe upset with me for watching a little bit too much of it, but I really couldn't look away because of how talented everyone that participated was. So thanks everyone who joined and was incredibly supportive and positive. Like, I heard nothing but rave reviews from people. We are in the process of taking all of the clips, everybody's individual performance, and kind of putting them together so that we can have a archive of all the performances, and we'll put that on YouTube and be sure to share it. So if there's anything that you missed, they will be going up on YouTube, so that we have that forever. Yeah, I really recommend you check it out if you haven't had a chance to, because we had some really fantastic local bands, local musicians. It really blew me away. And then, without missing a beat, the team came back on that wave of energy that they somehow still had after many of them being up for 24 hours, and had our biggest phone banking day ever yesterday. So we made over 17,200 calls just yesterday on Sunday. Awesome. We broke our record by over, I think that's over 300 calls. No, 1,300 calls, excuse me. So we broke our record by over 1,300 calls, and now we have broken that weekly goal as well as daily records for 2 weeks in a row. And these are the indicators that we are always looking at as metrics of how well this campaign is doing. Because we know that we win when we contact voters, and when we see these numbers going up, when we see more and more people jumping onto Phone Bank and signing up to volunteer, that's how we know we're succeeding. So I will always shout this out at the end, but I'm going to shout it out right now. If you haven't signed up to volunteer and to help us Phone Bank, please do that. You can do it at justfordelaware.com/volunteer. We have a fantastic team. They will get you trained very quickly and get you shifted to talk to Delawareans about how their lives should be better and how this world should be better. And really, that is the conversation we have. We don't have very scripted conversations. We have very personal conversations with people about why, when it's me, it's why am I running? When it's a volunteer or a team member, it's like, why am I working for this candidate, or why do I believe in this candidate? And those are the things that really break through to voters and get them excited and get them inspired to want to share this campaign and vote for me themselves. So it's incredibly important to help us out there. A couple other things I've done in the last week. I think you can tell that now that I've stopped working, there's a lot more time to focus on the campaign and do things. So we've been using that time. I was able to go on the Humanist Report, which is a show on YouTube, particularly about politics and more progressive politics. Did an interview there. We posted that video, I believe, today. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, we posted the link to YouTube on Facebook. So please check that out. And then I also did a interview with a show called Hill of Roses. Same thing, I'm pretty sure we've already shared that, but if you've missed it, just check out our posts. If you're ever interested in hearing me kind of talk about the things that are facing us and why I think this race is incredibly important, why I think it's incredibly winnable, and also why I'm in it in the first place and my vision for what the world should be. And the last thing I did last week is I did have the opportunity to speak to the RD17 Democratic Committee. Those are always enjoyable to get to kind of talk to the people who are doing the work of building democratic power in our state, who are committed to ensuring that we continue to do that because they know that work is incredibly important. And being able to share about our campaign and why I'm running and why people should get involved, always a great opportunity. If you have any groups or people that you want to pull together and have a conversation, do a meet and greet, anything like that, always feel free to reach out to us about that. We definitely want to make time for those kind of individual conversations. If someone is willing to host people and pull them together, we will absolutely be there. So you can always email us at info@justfordelaware.com if you are interested in that. Excuse me. So the next thing I wanted to talk about before we got into questions were a couple just news items that are happening. One very local and one local but also national. So I'll start kind of with the local story that I saw today. And that story was about the EPA and the Croda chemical plant here in our state. And the story, and the journalist who wrote the story, Carl Baker, and at the News Journal, basically uncovered that the chemical that is being manufactured at that plant, which we already knew was cancerous, is actually far more cancerous than we even originally thought. And we are now hearing that it's 30 times more cancerous than was previously thought. And what's incredibly frustrating about that is that this was actually known 3 years ago. Even before the Croda plant had a leak that, if you remember, shut down the Delaware Memorial Bridge and shut down the plant itself for, I believe, almost a full year. And now we're finding out that this information was not shared with the people who live around the facility and are at the highest risk for these health complications. And of course, many of the residents who live near that plant are predominantly Black and brown people. And this is the type of thing that we're talking about when we talk about environmental racism, how plants like this get put in places where they are closer to neighborhoods that are predominantly black and brown, and information like this, that you are living that close to a chemical that is even more dangerous than you even thought before, doesn't get shared with you. This is the type of thing that we absolutely need to be undoing the harm of and getting under regulatory control. So what's actually happening that's even worse and complicating this factor or compounding it is the fact that because of COVID-19 and this pandemic we've been living through, the federal government has actually lessened the EPA's enforcement abilities. So on top of now finding out that this chemical is far more dangerous, we also know that the EPA is not enforcing its regulations as strongly as it should. And this is a plant that has a disastrous record in our state. It is a perfect example of poisoning our air, land, and water, and the people who live here to turn a profit. And I think this is incredibly important, particularly when it comes to that EPA enforcement piece, because this is not something that we should be giving ground on or being weak on, particularly when we know that it is damaging the lives and the health of people in our state. But I do want to call out that in 2019, at a panel that was held on the idea of carbon pricing, aka taxing carbon emissions, my opponent expressed a willingness to trade away the EPA's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions in exchange for putting that price on carbon. And that is yet another place where we are weakening an agency that we know can actually be used to protect people's lives and health as a trade-off for a carbon tax, which is not even enough to really lessen emissions in the time that we need to prevent the worst effects of climate change. And these are the types of compromises that I criticize, because that is a compromise we should absolutely not be making, because it is a compromise that will be made on the backs of the most vulnerable people like our neighbors who live near the Crota plant. So this is incredibly frustrating. If you are able to read the article about it, please do. It's in the News Journal, and I think it's really important that we share this story and that people demand public hearings about it, and we figure out why this information was not shared with the residents near that plant when it should have been 3 years ago. Another thing that's going on that, again, is very local but has more national impact as well is headlines that are coming out this week referring to the quote-unquote tsunami of evictions that are feared to come in the coming weeks. And I'm sure to a lot of you this isn't a surprise. I mean, I myself have been saying since March, since this pandemic hit, that if we did not do something to ensure that people's rents were either forgiven or paid, we are going to have a public health crisis that will cascade into an economic crisis and then cascade into a housing crisis. And here we are 4 months later, and this is what is about to happen. The extra $600 a week unemployment payments that people were receiving as a part of the CARES Act that was signed in March are about to end. The Senate is basically doing nothing to fight for them and retain them. What's being proposed is a measly $200 a week at best, which, if, for example, if you were a worker in Delaware making $10 an hour, working full-time, and you've lost your job, from unemployment, you'd probably be getting about $225 a week. During this CARES Act period, where you've been getting an extra $600, that takes you up to $800 a week. People were able to feel a little more stable. But now what might happen is that you're only going to be at about $425 a week at best. And that's going to create a whole lot more instability in people's lives when we should be actually paying them to stay home and take care of themselves and ensure that they're healthy, because we clearly have not gotten a handle on this pandemic. And there has just been a failure, and I know I've said this, and I know it's probably not news to any of you, but there has been such a failure at all levels of government to protect people during this pandemic and to do what's right to ensure that people can stay in their homes, can stay fed, and can stay healthy. And that is the baseline of what our government should be able to do for us. Those are basic human rights that our government should be guaranteeing. And we are seeing kind of behind the veil here for these last 4 months. People were already experiencing this instability, but now the covers have been completely ripped off, and we see how extreme it really is. And while we have things like unemployment insurance and eviction moratoriums that were in place, these are solutions that don't actually fix the systemic problems that are causing instability in people's lives. They are band-aids that you can use in a moment of crisis to carry people over. But it doesn't change the fact that we're at risk of the same exact thing happening the next time there is a public health crisis in our country, the next extreme weather event, or frankly, the next recession. We actually need to be fighting for legislation and programs that address these root causes and the facts that people all over our country, far too many of them, are living paycheck to paycheck. And if there is any hiccup that disrupts one of those paychecks, they are on the edge of a cliff. And there's not enough protections for people against evictions. And I'm sure you've heard that people are making more from this added and unemployment insurance than many were at their jobs. And I think a lot of people take that as, oh, we shouldn't be paying people to stay home more than they were working. And that is absolutely the wrong takeaway here. We should be appalled that people weren't making enough, that unemployment insurance is actually paying them more than they were at their job. Because that $600 a week figure that was added into the CARES Act, that's what you make when you make $15 an hour. There's a reason that number was chosen. And that is what we have kind of said is the bare minimum for some kind of stability in your life. And that's why it was given to people during this extreme crisis. So locally, there's a reason this is relevant. There are about 30%, more than 30%, of Delaware renters who are at risk of eviction because of this pandemic right now. And the moratorium that was on evictions in our state was actually lifted on July 1st, and landlords were again able to file evictions against tenants who've been unable to pay their rent during this period. We're not through this yet. People have not gone back to work in the numbers that we need them to truly be able to say that they are able to start paying rent again. So what is happening right now is that any evictions that are being filed are going to the Justice of Peace Court, and the court is trying to find some sort of alternate resolution on a case-by-case basis. So that means that they're going to try to find ways to avoid eviction, but there's no guarantee. And no matter what, whether they find an alternative or not, that person is going to be living through a period of housing instability that was entirely preventable and entirely unnecessary. And these are the things that I keep coming back to in these conversations we have, is that we can't keep looking at, oh, a crisis is hitting, how do we address it in this moment? We have to be building systems and structures that we know will carry us through when a crisis hits, because they are going to keep coming. Public health crises probably will happen again. We know climate change is coming, so there will be extreme weather, there will be increased pandemics likely because of climate change. So we know these things are going to happen. We have to build a system that can actually withstand them rather than requiring our government to try to legislate its way out of a crisis in the moment, because we have seen how we fail when that happens. All right, so thank you for hearing me on that. It's something that I'm incredibly frustrated by, and I think you can probably tell that because, again, all of this was just so preventable and unnecessary. And those are the things that I think are most upsetting, is when we cause human suffering for absolutely no reason. Okay, so I'm going to hit questions now. One that I want to start on is one that comes up a lot, actually, and I haven't really talked about it as much on the live stream, so I want to make sure I'm addressing it. And that question is, why did you decide to run for office? And what I like to tell people is that it's kind of something that's both a long decision and then it happens really quickly, right? Like there are things that have built up to that decision to run for office. One kind of longer term thing has been my experience in the workplace. And I've talked about, if you haven't heard me before, I'll share again, that in the very first job that I worked at, I was sexually assaulted by a manager in that job and had no real supports there, no one to turn to. There was no structure for being offered protection. It was either you put up with it or you leave the job and you go find another one. And that story is far too common. Not even just assault, but harassment, being marginalized, being mistreated at work, and having no real support there to turn to. It also comes in the form of other experiences I've had where working jobs where I wasn't paid wages enough to get by, or I was intentionally kept part-time so that I couldn't get benefits or that I couldn't really make enough money to survive, so I had to piece together multiple jobs. Working in places in restaurants, for example, where the owners of the restaurants skim tips and you end up with a little lighter stack at the end of the evening. And working jobs where I wasn't offered health insurance, where I wasn't paid a living wage. All of these experiences built up over time and made me realize that, there's no reason for people to have to struggle this way, particularly when it's so broad-based. This is not an individual problem, right? This is a failure to support labor and worker power in our country over the course of generations. And one of the key ways that I wanted to ensure that particularly young girls didn't necessarily go through the experiences that I did was by giving back to my community and building community. So I did that predominantly through volunteerism and nonprofit work. And I did some tutoring and mentoring of elementary age students. And again, like recognizing that these students are struggling unnecessarily. They're clearly capable of doing the work. They need someone to give them the individual attention that they need so they can flourish. But when we underfund our schools, when we keep our class sizes far too large, when we don't provide teachers with the supplies they need or the aids they need or the counselors that are needed in schools to ensure that kids are able to learn, then students look like they're failing. But really it's us that's failing them. And from there and that work, I again looked for another place where I can build on that, and that's when I joined the board of a statewide nonprofit here in Delaware and became the board president there. And that nonprofit was focused on delivering programming to girls who were coming from under-resourced neighborhoods, who needed it the most. And that was really near and dear to my heart, of being able to be a part of the work that helps a girl see her worth and find her place in the world so that she can flourish in it. And I saw that happen with a lot of the girls who came through that center. And they were coming from neighborhoods where their moms and dads were working multiple jobs and still struggling to get by, not making nearly enough money in that work, being underpaid and abused in that work, coming from homes that were not kept up, and honestly, in some cases, making them sick. Coming from neighborhoods that had far too much violence and crime because of these conditions of poverty that people were living in. And while we were able to do really fantastic work with those individual girls and give them a safe space where they're able to grow, the point of recognition for me, and that drove me to run for office, was that is treating symptoms of a problem. It is not actually solving the problem, because until we actually solve the problem of all of the conditions in those girls' lives that are making them need that programming and those services, there's always going to be another girl ready to come through that door. And that was the change that I really want to make. I want to make it so that every single person in this country is able to have a dignified standard of living, because I know that is possible. And we can do all of these things when we work together. We have more than enough ability and resources to do this. What we actually need are people who are committed to doing the work and who actually see the world this way, who aren't limited by their idea of the way that the world currently works, but are actually saying, no, I know better is possible and I want to fight for it with you together. And that is how I decided to run for office, and to run for this office where I can actually enact the change that I want to see in the world. All right, so question here from Fred. Fred asks, oh, there's a few. Okay, I'm going to go one at a time, Fred. So first question is views on gun control. So I see gun violence as a symptom, again, a little bit of what I was just talking about, a symptom of the broken structures in our country, particularly things like our economic structures. Crime in neighborhoods comes out of poverty and unemployment and homelessness. All of these things, if we fix these problems, they drastically reduce gun violence. Their studies have been conducted that show this. That being said, that is why I'm running on a lot of the things I am. But on top of that, I support an assault weapons buyback, something that actually, frankly, my opponent has mocked as a bad idea that will simply give the NRA something to run on. And I believe that we need to be moving toward a stronger permitting process for guns, and making sure that guns aren't going to people who don't know how to use them. I believe that we should be providing training to ensure that anyone who wants a gun knows how to safely use it, that they have proven that they are capable of using it, that they have safe storage. All of those things that we know make gun ownership safer are incredibly important. So then Fred's next question is about offshore wind power and the possibility for Delaware. I absolutely think that we should be investing in wind power in our state and at a federal level. We know that we need to completely divest from fossil fuels if we have any hope of combating climate change and preventing the worst effects of it. And we're going to need a combination of renewable energy that includes solar and wind. And I believe that wind offshore Delaware is something that we should absolutely be investing in. And I just saw that there was some research done into this, and people were given a simulation essentially to show them, okay, if we placed wind turbines at these distances from the shore, this is what it would look like. And what was found is that most people were completely okay with them once they were, I believe it was about 5 miles off of shore. So I know that there's been a lot of kind of back and forth in this conversation, but we know that we need to move away from fossil fuels. We know that we have renewable resources. We have to be doing all that we can to capture them and use that energy source to feed into our grid. And that is a big reason why I support enacting a Green New Deal. It would expand that renewable energy production. And what's incredibly important about that program is that it also would create thousands of well-paying federal jobs. And it's not just about preventing climate change. It's about undoing the harm, like we were just talking about with Crota, like repairing our environment and fixing environmental degradation, but also baking in that piece of how do we actually create a good life for people. And we can do that through a federal jobs guarantee as part of a Green New Deal that says anyone who wants a job, we can give a job to. So I do believe that developing offshore wind power in Delaware is a major part of this, and we don't have time to waste. That is another thing that has driven me into this race and driven me to run, is that we don't have time to not take the dramatic steps to protect ourselves and to actually invest in things that we know will address climate change head on. And then Fred had one more question, and it was about term limits on Congress. So this is something I've talked about a little bit before. And I am not really a supporter of term limits. I think what we need to do instead to really increase democracy is to get money out of politics and to move toward publicly financed elections. Because if we enact term limits without actually democratizing the process of elections, we can actually create a system that allows for more political dynasties, where as soon as someone's about to be term limited out, the powers that be, the moneyed interests, are able to kind of queue up the next person that they want to get behind and fund, and would lead to incumbents potentially choosing their successors. And it would make, frankly, it could make it even harder for campaigns like ours or other insurgent campaigns to break out of that. So what I think is more important is that we say we're done with money in politics, and we publicly fund elections, because that actually means that everyone is working with the same amount of money to get elected. And it opens up the ability to get elected to far more people, particularly lower income and working class people who we need to be representing us in our government. Because the idea of raising money for a campaign right now is so daunting for so many people. The idea of having to leave your job to do this work is impossible for so many people. So when we can actually get money out of politics, publicly finance elections, I believe that will fix a lot of the influence that people usually look at term limits to solve. And the counterpoint is that term limits also have the potential to oust really good Congress people who we don't want to lose, and who their voters and their constituents would want to send back. So while it's something that I know we look to when we see people who have been in these seats for so long and seem so entrenched, and yet failing to be responsive to their needs of their constituents, I look at it more of, why are they actually failing to be responsive? And I don't necessarily think it's simply a factor of time. I think it's an issue of who are they bought and paid for by. All right. So next question. Okay. Seth says, if you were Queen of America, how would you resolve the situation in Portland? Well, first of all, I do not support monarchy, so I do not want to accept the role as Queen of America. But let's just say I have the ability to enact the change that I want to see right now. This is a huge reason why I have supported demilitarizing the police from the beginning. You know, the gear and the weaponry and the equipment that we have seen police have in response to protest against police brutality has been extreme and uncalled for. And they only have this gear predominantly because of federal programs that transfer it to them from the military. So ending those programs is incredibly important to me, number one. The other piece is that we need to end these programs that exist within the Department of Homeland Security, and particularly agencies like ICE, that are being used as essentially unidentified secret police forces to break up dissent, break up communities, and take people away. So if you are upset about what you're seeing in Portland right now, I hope you are also on board with abolishing ICE. So I want to just make sure that comes through, because this is what has been happening to undocumented immigrants in our country for years. These same types of tactics are used, the same type of showing up in identifying yourself as some sort of officer of some kind, but taking people and stepping all over their rights, locking people up and taking them away from their families and their communities, and in cases of undocumented immigrants, then deporting them off into countries that they don't even know as home. So those are the types of programs that we absolutely need to scale back on militarization as a whole on our streets and across the world. And I think we really need to be calling on our local governments to rein in the behaviors and authority of police departments, because that is what's feeding into this response. These types of abuses have happened by the local police force in these cities for years. And while this is an escalation, it's really an escalation that has been predated by kind of a slippery slope that's getting us here. So this is why I support redirecting funds from military and police forces into investing in our actual communities, into funding social services that actually protect us, that actually make us safer. I've said a few times that the communities that are safest are not the ones that have the most police, they're the ones that have the most resources. So we should be ensuring that communities that need the most help get resources, not just policing. And yeah, I think just in general, it's incredibly important that everyone raise their voice right now and say they are unequivocally opposed to what is happening in Portland, and maybe is now expanding to, I believe Chicago was mentioned, and a few other cities, because this is how authoritarianism creeps in, this is how a police state becomes normalized, and this is not something we can stand for in the slightest. We also need to be demanding that the committees that exist in our government who actually have oversight of these programs, some of which my opponent sits on, are actually using their authority to ask questions of what's going on, to investigate what's going on, to stop these efforts to use Homeland Security forces and ICE forces as secret police in our cities and towns. Okay, so Seth has another question. Why do you think federally financed housing is a better solution to the problem of affordable housing as opposed to a universal basic income that would allow Americans to leverage the market and make housing choices themselves? This is only going to be exacerbated in the future as more Americans find themselves unemployed due to automation, and you yourself said that you're expecting significantly more crises in the future. So one thing I just want to make sure is clear, that I don't oppose the use of UBI or universal basic income. I think that we have to really think about it as a tool that can be used in a larger set of social services. What I get a little concerned about is some conversations around UBI where some people talk about it as a panacea, that we would no longer need the social programs that we have or that we're demanding be expanded because people would have a universal basic income. So I think it's incredibly important that we talk about it as an and rather than an or. UBI doesn't necessarily end instability in people's lives, and it doesn't necessarily end the class divisions that we see between people. So I want to make sure we're always focused on, like, how do we eradicate those inequalities as well, because it's not just a matter of how much money does someone have in their pocket at any given moment, and are they having coming in every month. We know that there literally just isn't enough affordable housing stock in our country, and that's why I do believe that investment in federal housing programs and actually building out additional units is incredibly important. We posted about this a few weeks ago, and forgive me that I'm gonna mess the numbers up, but in the state of Delaware, for every 100 people who are looking for affordable housing across all 3 counties, on average, there's only about, I think, fewer than 50 units that they can actually find. So it's not just a matter of being able to pay for it, it's that we actually need to increase the stock of housing that is available for people. And it's a way to also update our infrastructure, ensure that we are building housing that is resistant to climate change and also greener and running, able to be run on renewable energy, so that we don't continue to contribute to climate change. And because the only development that we really see, particularly in our state, is at a higher end. You know, I live in the city of Wilmington, where predominantly what is being built are luxury condos that the vast majority of people can't afford to live in. So there's a real gap in our housing market that I believe needs to be filled through federal investment. All right, and then Seth has another question. All right, so how do you manage the more specific problems of Medicare for All? I'm tentatively in favor of Medicare for All, but the specifics are going to be very difficult to implement. How do you balance reimbursement to doctors in a way that both doesn't incentivize doctors to perform unnecessary procedures, but also not incentivize to help their patients at the lowest possible cost to maximize cash flow? And how do you encourage doctors to relocate to areas that are healthcare deserts and most in need of healthcare? These are all fantastic questions. So one thing that's sometimes a little unfortunate about Medicare for All is that we're not talking about Medicare in its current state. So we are not saying that we would simply switch over to the existing plan, because anyone who is on Medicare knows that it's actually not fully comprehensive, right? There's parts that you have to buy separately to piece together close to comprehensive coverage, and then even in that cases there's these gaps, particularly when it comes to prescription coverage and some other things that people can fall into. So we have to actually talk about expanding even what Medicare is and truly make a comprehensive program. And that also includes the reimbursement systems. You know, we have to ensure that we are paying doctors and healthcare workers good wages for the work that they do. We have to ensure that private practice doctors are not being pushed out, which they are so forcibly right now, because frankly a lot of what I've heard from people is administrative costs that go into dealing with the vast majority of private insurance companies that require an incredible amount of overhead, that require an incredible amount of just frankly time on the phone working through administrative tasks, increased insurance costs that doctors need to carry on their own. A lot of it is actually disincentivizing private practitioners because of it becoming easier to frankly be part of a conglomerate or a massive hospital system, and it's caused a lot of the monopolization really of healthcare systems. Is we don't see as many individual family practice doctors. We see a lot of hospital systems that then have family practice offices. So we have to ensure that the reimbursement rates actually match what is needed to run a practice, pay for the care that people need. And you're right, we don't want situations where doctors are just trying to keep costs low and maximize cash flow. Like that is not what we're looking for, because again, that is keeping a profit motive in healthcare. That is actually what we are working to remove. It's not about how much money you can make. It's about how, or it shouldn't be about how much money you make. It's how much care can we deliver effectively to ensure that we actually have a healthcare system, rather than the system right now that is really much more about sickness and doesn't lead to good outcomes for the people who need the most help and need their health improved. You ask a question also about how do you get the types of doctors that you need in the places that you need them. So we should absolutely be looking at globally funding these things and saying, okay, in XYZ area, there's a real dearth of cardiologists. Let's ensure that we are offering incentives for cardiologists to move to this area, but let's also ensure that we have enough family care practitioners or cardiologists, whatever those jobs are, by ensuring that we deliver things like free public college tuition, because a lot of doctors are incentivized to go into really specific specialties because of the need to make money, pay off their loans that they are taking on to get this really specialized education. And it's leading to situations where we have very few just general practitioners anymore, because that is not as rewarding, and leads to people having student loan debt for longer than they would if they went into a specialty. I think that there's some concern too about, are doctors going to be trying to recommend unnecessary procedures. Um, I don't really know that that's a concern, as that I've heard it of people kind of trying to say um, that doctors will deliver unnecessary care to try to make more money off the system. I think that what the actual focus is right now is that people can actually get the care that's necessary to keep them healthy, to save their life. And that's what a lot of doctors and medical workers that I have spoken to are concerned about, is how do we actually ensure that people can get the procedures that they need to stay healthy. Noah asked, do you support the elimination of the filibuster? I do. I think that if we have any chance of passing the policies that we need to address the things that people need most, like Medicare for All or a Green New Deal, we absolutely need to get rid of the filibuster. And I don't know why we would hamstring ourselves when we have seen years and years of Republican control working to play by their own set of rules. The last thing I would do is put in place more obstruction when, particularly if we take back power. I think that would be really short-sighted and a failure of leadership to see this as an opportunity to actually make our government work for everybody. So Michael asks, I love your passion. Thanks, Michael. And do you think it's humanly possible to send Delaware kids back to school without risking their health, even with all of the guidelines in place? So I can only really go by what I'm hearing from educators and parents. And right now I'm hearing a lot of concern that it's not going to be safe. I'm also hearing a lot of concern about the social effects and just overall education effects on students. Kids are certainly suffering during this time, lacking the social outlets that they're used to, not getting the education that is crucial at this point in their lives. But there's also a real bind that we have put people in, particularly because we have failed to take care of people during this pandemic and ensure that they are safe and healthy and have the money they need to survive. I know this weekend that someone reached out and basically was saying how if schools don't reopen, but she has to go back to work, what is she able to do with her child? How does she know her child's going to be safe if they do reopen? And we've really put parents, I think, in a terrible position, and educators as well, where we are forcing them to make a decision that they should absolutely not have to make. And it's really frustrating to know that we shut down schools when our actual number of daily cases were much lower in many parts of the country. And we're seeing our government cancel large in-person events. We're talking the RMC is not going to happen in person, the DNC convention is not going to happen in person, but it's okay to go back to school. I don't know that there's a good answer here, and I do think that I tend to lean with the educators who are really concerned about this, because I think what has happened is that we keep hearing how a lot of businesses and schools and any facilities that want to reopen, they keep telling us about their rigorous cleaning processes, but that really ignores the fact that this seems to be a predominantly airborne disease. So for as much as, my gym might be scrubbing everything and Lysoling everything, that doesn't actually mean that it's ensuring that there's not air transmission happening. So I'm not sure that the protocols when it comes to cleaning are really, they feel a little bit like they're there to kind of allay fears, but they're not actually effective. I don't know how you're going to take a class size that maybe has 25 or more kids in it and cut it down so that kids can be spaced and that teachers can be spaced so that they can stay safe. I haven't really seen plans that make me feel good about in-person instruction. But I know that there are real concerns about kids not getting back to school from just a mental health standpoint. An educator who reached out and heard that 2 of her students had actually taken their own lives during this time because of social isolation and mental health issues that were coming from it. And we know that the lack of digital connectivity and devices are a real problem for a lot of students, particularly low-income students who are unable to do online schooling. We lack internet in many places in our state. And students were told to go sit in parking lots where there was Wi-Fi. And that's, again, one of those, in the moment, sure, that's a solution, but we can't rely on that going forward, which is why the internet needs to be a public utility that is piped into every single person's home. So I think this is a tough question, and I think my stance is that, again, from what I'm seeing, it does not feel like in-person instruction is going to be safe at this point. And I think that we should be really focused on using these 5 or so weeks that we have to really get this under control. I'm sure a lot of people have seen that estimates that say, studies that say if we wore masks for 6 weeks, we could eradicate this. And the fact that we can't get people on board with doing that is incredibly frustrating. And that's what I think we should be focused on, is how do we actually end this, not how do we make sure that kids and teachers have to go back in the middle of this. Fred asks about the Electoral College. Is that still needed? I don't think so. I think the Electoral College is inherently undemocratic. I support the Electoral Vote Compact, the National Vote Compact that has been passed to base electoral votes off of the national popular vote. Kelsey asked, have you done any polling? The media in Delaware is continuing to treat the corporate Democrat as the presumptive nominee. No, unfortunately, polling is very expensive. So most campaigns like ours don't really do it, but we are phone banking every single day. And when we talk to voters about why we're running and what we're running on, they overwhelmingly support this. You know, it's rare that we have a lot of people who are opposed to the things we are fighting for. And that is because we are speaking directly to the problems that people are facing, and we're talking about solutions that we can fight for together. So, no, we have not done polling, but I feel very confident in that what we are running on is the right thing to be running on for the people in our state. I know that they support it. This is why volunteering is incredibly important, because the more people we talk to, and frankly, the sooner we talk to them, is incredibly valuable. And if you join us and you have these phone banking conversations, I think you'll find that too. That the majority of conversations, people are happy to know they have a choice, and they're happy to hear that we are running on a platform that says people deserve to be taken care of by their government. They deserve to be placed over the needs of corporations. All right. Well, how much time? 5 minutes. Jessica asks, how do you feel about the current treatment of our inmates and the inhumane treatment they are enduring? I agree that it's inhumane. This is another thing that we have talked about from the very beginning, and echoing, you know, what we hear from organizations like the ACLU and other advocates for people who are incarcerated, is that what we should have done from the very beginning is decarcerated people. Particularly in the midst of this pandemic, right? I mean, there's kind of the overall inhumane treatment of incarcerated people, but speaking right now just about what's going on in this pandemic, a huge amount of people in our prisons and jails are people who are there on what's called pretrial detention. So these are people who are being held because they can't post bail, but they have not been convicted of a crime. people like that who are on pretrial detainee, but for nonviolent crimes in particular, should have been released to free up space in prisons and ensure that there is not overcrowding going on. Just last week, I attended a protest that was happening at the Sussex County institution because over a third of the inmates there had tested positive. And inmates were saying they were being moved, after testing positive to places where other people had not tested positive and potentially creating an issue of spread. And during this time, people were reporting that the cost of phone calls actually increased, and then the time was limited, making it even more difficult for people during this incredibly scary and dangerous time to be in touch with their families. So I am for decarceration and moving toward a more restorative justice system in our country, because we have seen that our prisons do not rehabilitate people. And often people who are serving long sentences are not learning anything in 10 years that they weren't going to learn in 2 or 5. And it causes more disruption in their lives and the lives of their families and their communities because they have been pulled out of those things. It disrupts their ability to ever have real economic prospects in the future, because finding a job after being incarcerated is incredibly challenging. And we know that particularly sentences are disproportionately longer when the person being sentenced is black or brown. And these are the types of things that we have to eradicate from the system. So I support decriminalizing poverty. People should not be thrown in jail for crimes of poverty and their inability to pay for things. We need to legalize marijuana so that it cannot be used as a tool to imprison people, as well as expunging the records of people who have federal marijuana charges. And I think, again, I've mentioned this before, but we decrease crime rates when we increase funding to communities that need it most. And we decrease crime when everyone has a good paying job. These are the things that we should actually be investing in to ensure that we don't have to use prisons as a method to house people that could otherwise be a part of our society if we actually took care of the needs and figured out what it is that they need individually and filled that gap for them. All right, so I'm almost out of time. I'm going to try to get the last couple that are here. So Dana asks, okay, across the country and in Delaware, homeless populations are disproportionately represented by people with mental illness. Despite research showing that mental illness cannot be, quote-unquote, arrested away, persons with mental illness continue to be victims of police brutality and make up anywhere from 60 to 80% of jail populations, both nationally and locally. Absolutely. With criminal justice reform on the forefront of conversations, how will you ensure that issues around mental illness are also considered and addressed? And then with major budget cuts, how will you protect funding that's allocated for mental health treatment and services? So I completely agree with what you're saying. Mental illness should not be treated, quote unquote, with arrest. I actually spoke to a woman at SEI who talked exactly about this, and I would put addiction in here as well. I think they're not the same issue, but they are really issues that are related and are often treated the same way with arrest. And the woman that I spoke to was talking about how her partner was in prison because of drug use and addiction, but was not getting the care he needed to actually treat that addiction and then the underlying issues that were causing it while he was incarcerated. So I completely agree that mental health issues as well as addiction are not criminal issues. They should not be treated with arrest. We need to actually look at, again, how do we fix the problem that the person is suffering from rather than just punishing them for having that problem. As a society and culturally, we are far too quick to look for a punitive measure rather than to say, what is it that drove this person here, and how do we step it back a few steps and fix that problem. So again, moving toward community-based mental health resources, supporting things like Medicare for All. When I talk about Medicare for All being comprehensive means it includes the whole self, and that is medical coverage, dental coverage, eye care, vision or hearing care, and mental health services, as well as addiction treatment. All of these things should be covered because they are part of our whole self. And I think for those that are incarcerated, even if they are not incarcerated due to mental health issues, which I agree they should not be, there should be far more investment in mental health resources within those prisons, because we know that people who are imprisoned, it can really impact your way of thinking, your way of behaving, and people who are incarcerated need help to ensure that that doesn't become a long-term issue, so that we don't create mental health issues because of incarceration. So I think, again, the way we really combat this is moving toward a more restorative justice system, saying that how do we rehabilitate rather than simply punish, and how do we ensure people who, if they are imprisoned, they get comprehensive mental health care through that, because that is a traumatic experience no matter who you are. And what we should really be looking at is ensuring that we aren't doing more damage to people and their communities through incarceration, which we often are right now. All right, I think there's one more question. Let's see. All right. In a recent interview, you mentioned Big Pharma as a major source of PAC money of your opponent. Do you have any other examples of PACs that are supporting him and potentially influencing voting decisions? Yeah, so just so everyone kind of has the background that Amanda's coming from with this question, I've talked about how my opponent is, sometimes it changes, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the rankings of receiving the most pharmaceutical money. And what that has resulted in are votes that favor the pharmaceutical industry. So he opposed bills that would have imported drugs and lower drug costs. He opposes things like Medicare for All, saying that, this is pie in the sky and a complete dream, even though it's a system that works in dozens of other countries. And he has crafted legislation that would actually make it easier for pharmaceutical companies to defend weak patents, keeping their profits high and preventing generics from coming on the market. So some other examples. We talked a little bit about housing earlier. One local large developers large contributor are luxury developers, real estate developers such as Buccini Pollen Group here in Wilmington, defense contractors, and just some recent votes that we saw from the senator opposing ending having troops in Afghanistan, though they've been there for almost 20 years. Opposing cutting just 10% from the military budget and directing it towards services that people need, particularly in this time of crisis. Those are 2 votes that he took just in the last couple weeks. He has taken, I believe this cycle, the second most amount of money from the Fraternal Order of Police, and we've seen how that's influenced his decisions as well. He joined Republicans in 2014 to block President Obama's nomination to the Department of Justice head of the Civil Rights Division. And this is a lawyer named Debo Adegbile. This was a vote that he took, breaking with the party, because the Fraternal Order Police was unhappy with a client that Mr. Adegbile had represented in his work as a lawyer. And my opponent listened to the Fraternal Order of Police and opposed that nomination, and it failed. And that Office of Civil Rights is incredibly important at the Department of Justice because it has oversight of a lot of the things that we're seeing in our current conversation about police brutality. So that is a decision that could have had us on a different track, but you could see how the influence of the people who gave him money influenced his decision. A couple others, the National Chicken Council, chicken processing plants and the companies that run those plants clearly have a lot of influence in our state. It's why we haven't seen really any response from our delegation on the poisoned water wells that people are living with because of runoff from the Mount Ayr chicken processing plant. So, for example, the CEOs and the moneyed interests of these corporations, these chicken processing plant corporations, such as Ron Cameron from Mount Ayr, who's also a major Donald Trump donor, they give money to the National Chicken Council, and then Senator Coons takes money from the National Chicken Council. And what ends up happening is that things like that poisoning of drinking water, things like the COVID-19 outbreaks that were happening at these meat processing facilities just get ignored by our delegation. And these are Delawareans who are dying because of the actions of these corporations. And my opponent is failing to stand up for them and even just say anything about what they are suffering through. This is also a company in Mount Ayr in particular that is actively trying to union bust at its plant in Selbyville. And they were working against actually providing their workers with the PPE that they needed to do their jobs. So their workers were forced to go to work in the middle of a pandemic, and the company didn't want to provide them social distancing work as well as PPE to keep them safe. The company actually docked their pay to pay for their own supplies that they needed to do their job. These are the types of corporate interests that my opponent's taking money from and then turning a blind eye to the actions that they take. A final one is still kind of related to pharmaceuticals, but the support of and advocacy of Secretary Azar to run the Department of Health and Human Services. My opponent campaigned for Secretary Azar. He made comments that he would do the job competently and told other Democrats to vote in favor for him. Well, Secretary Azar is currently completely failing to lead the Department of Health and Human Services in the midst of a global pandemic. And the reason is because he is a drug company executive. He was a drug company executive at Eli Lilly, which is another contributor to my opponent. And we have seen that Eli Lilly contributes to my opponent. My opponent supports their former executive and a drug company lobbyist for a position that he does not have a public health background to fill. And these are the things that actually lead to harm in people's lives. More than 500 Delawareans have died because of this pandemic. That's not competent leadership from the head of Health and Human Services. Alex Azar is not just only not a public health expert, but he's also outwardly anti-choice. This was known when he was being confirmed. And again, the senator who claims to fight for women and protect women's reproductive rights voted to confirm him anyway. Alex Azar attended a pro-life event and for the day renamed the Department of Health and Human Services the Department of Life in honor of that pro-life, anti-choice, anti-women's rights event. He's also levied, frankly, attacks on the health care of LGBTQ people just last month, in the midst of Pride Month, making it harder and working with President Trump to make it so that transgender people can't get the health care that they need. So these are the types of things that I call my opponent out on, because you advocated for this person. You told other Democrats that he will do this job well, all while he opposed things that you claim to support. And those are the types of things that infuriate me and a lot of other people, and drive us to action, like running for office, like fighting back against this, because you cannot say one thing and have a record that completely stands against those things. And that's what I see in some of these actions that are driven by campaign contributions. All right, I have gone long, so I appreciate whoever has hung on for hanging on with me, but I wanted to make sure that I got to every question, because I know that I don't often get through them all, so I apologize. But thank you all for your fantastic questions. If there are some I missed, we always try to go back through, but DM me, send a message, and we'll make sure we answer. If you've been following along on Facebook, you've seen that we have campaign signs as well as t-shirts. You can order a t-shirt on our website at justfordelaware.com/shop, and we will get those out to you. And if you want to request a yard sign, the easiest way to do that is just to send us a message on Facebook or send an email to info@justfordelaware.com. Include just your name and the address where you want the sign dropped off, as well as a phone number, just to make it easy to get in contact with you to coordinate that drop off. So I'm excited. I've been seeing those go up. I've been seeing people. We've sold a whole lot of t-shirts, actually, like more than dozens of them. So we'll be getting those out in the mail to people shortly. And we are about 7 weeks from the primary. And I know that can still sound long. I mean, it's like 2 months. No, every day is going to count from here on out. We have to be raising as much money as we possibly can and doing as much voter contact as we possibly can. And I know that you're probably sick of hearing me say that, but these are the things that lead to wins. And we are doing our best to stay focused on those things to lead to that win. So if you can donate, please do so. Every dollar genuinely counts. It goes into being able to call voters. It goes into buying mailers to get them in front of the people that we haven't been able to reach on the phone. So if you're able to donate, please do. You can do it at justfordelaware.com/donate. And ask your friends to donate. One of the best things to do is to share that you've donated and go see if there's someone who will be willing to match it. And then encourage them to see if there's someone that can match it, because that's how you make your one donation kind of so much bigger, than it has a bigger impact than just one donation was. You can turn it into multiple donations. Same thing goes for volunteering. Sign up to volunteer. We will train you. It's not scary. It's actually really fun to talk to voters and talk to them about their lives and share why this is important to you. And you can do that, sign up at justfordelaware.com/volunteer. Same thing, bring friends. When you bring friends, that's how we get to these record-breaking days where we're calling more than 17,000 people. Because every single person who signs on to make calls makes it faster for every other person who's on. So it makes it more fun, you've got someone to do it with, and then it also means that we're more productive when we get through to more people. So again, please sign up. And yeah, see you here again next Monday. Invite your friends. There's a Facebook invite and event already up, so please share that. Tell people to come along. If you talk to anyone about this campaign throughout the week, always recommend they join the Facebook Live. You know, I try to answer every question as best I can, and I'm always willing to even follow up if I don't get to your question or if you have follow-ups. So I really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining. I appreciate you sticking with me for an extra 15 minutes if you're still here. And yeah, thanks so much.